All right, welcome back to another episode of the Design, Build, Hunt podcast, which is presented by Whitetail Partners. I've got Dylan from Kansas, Lee from Tennessee, Sam from Wisconsin, and Jake from Michigan, all on the line today. I won't ask you guys how you're doing because there's too many of you, but it is October, what is today, the 30th, as we're recording this. So the best of the whitetail rut is just ahead of us, the best of the hunting season. I know for some folks like Lee, maybe there's a few more weeks out, but not a long time before some of the best hunting of the year is upon us. Jake, I want to kick things off with you. We talked last week about the pre-rut, how you kind of conceptualize the pre-rut, what kind of deer behavior you're seeing during the pre-rut, and how you're hunting that. I want to kick it off with you and just say, how do you view that transition from pre-rut to what you would consider the rut on your ground? Because I think sometimes there's a misconception of like up until Halloween, that's pre-rut. And then November 1st hits and like all the deer got the memo on Halloween night. They're like, okay, now the rut is on. So tomorrow, November 1st, we run around like crazy and let people shoot at us. So I don't know that that's correct. Jake, how do you think about it?
I think it's kind of a slow build. It's probably going to start different at different times at different parts of the country. For us, it's around the 20th of October. We start to see more activity from those older bucks on our properties, and it's a slow build up until around Halloween. And that's where I think most years those first couple does go into estrus, and it's not that the bucks are running all over the place, but up until that point, it's really just the young bucks that are pushing the does around. Right around Halloween, November 1st, that's when you might start seeing like some of those older bucks actually following those does around. Like they're if you have a hot doe on your property, she can sometimes have a couple bucks following her in the early part of the rut. So for us, again, it starts around that Halloween time frame. So tomorrow, that's sometimes where you can get only a few does in heat, and so that could be a pretty exciting time when there's only a few. Then you're going to have more attention from the bucks.
All right. Dylan, I'm curious with you being, over in Kansas, obviously very different area than Michigan and what Jake is dealing with there. How does that transition look for you? And, do those dates kind of line up, or do you see a different timetable?
I think, Josh, we're a little bit delayed. A lot of people get ramped up. Obviously, Halloween's kind of that trigger. The flip the calendar is another big piece, but I feel like we're almost a week behind sometimes. For our key rut dates, it's just a little bit further back, if in my opinion. I'm a big scrape hunter. Most guys know that, and so I feel when a lot of people say that they start dying off on the scrapes, that first week of November, I see. Alternatively, here in Kansas, I think really gets to rocking in those key dates that I like. The 6th through the 10th. That roughly. I would say probably my strategies from the pre-rut stance, it doesn't change a lot. I still like to concentrate the movement on bed to feed if you can. I hunt those transition zones and trying to catch them in those areas around those scrapes. But the biggest thing for me is really just kind of the transition from lower odds or lower what I consider lesser setups and working my way to those more I guess tried and true rut setups. For me, that's kind of what transitions where I'm saving those, making sure they're fresh, and then all bets are off once we hit November. I'm just looking at the weather, wind direction, speeds, all that kind of stuff.
Right. Sam, I want to hear a little bit from you there. Where we hunted in Wisconsin, or where I hunted in Wisconsin, was just an hour or two from where you are. So kind of similar areas, but I know you always liked that end of October time frame. And then for me, I really, really liked that, first week of November. And that was when I was really targeting scrapes and seeing a lot of scraping activity. You were kind of targeting them before that, about a week before. So it just goes to show there can be some timing difference. So how do you line up with what you've heard Jake and Dylan say?
And I'd say they're all three of you are accurate in what you've said, and specifically, it's what is the strategy? If the strategy is you have very consistent travel corridors and you have mock scrapes at certain intervals on them. You have predictable buck movement that I would say the pre-rut, like as Jake would describe in October 20 to 20th to the end of the month, in that time frame, you're having that consistent movement, checking and refreshing of scrapes. And I like that time frame because it's the more predictable part in my experience. However, getting into that, and again, it builds, it's not like a light switch, but it builds into that activity in early November when bucks are really starting to opening up their range. They're cruising more. Cruising is a term I like to use during this time frame because they are covering ground. So for me, my type of setup I'm going to is in hill country are the tops of the terrain, long ridge systems. I want to be on a ridge system that may be miles long, and you have the opportunity to catch a pinch point where that buck is trying to cover a ton of ground, and he may be going from one side of the ridge to the other and crisscrossing that ridge for miles, trying to find that doe bedding area that he wants to investigate a little bit more. So for me, it is that building time, and if you're looking for more of that longer range cruising buck, maybe it's a buck you might have had one or two pictures of, you're kind of on the fringe of his range. Getting into November might be a great time because he might go for that several mile cruise and bump into you on that ridge.
Gotcha. Lee, you're down south like I am. What does that look like for you? I think, I don't know specifically about your area of Tennessee, but I know like where I'm at in Georgia and our farm in Alabama, the rut looks very, very different than it does in the Midwest. How does that line up for you?
It does. So I'm in a part of Tennessee where I actually have fairly low deer density versus a lot of my peers. So pre-rut, I can really hone in on my doe families. I really like paying attention to those doe families. I can tell when there's a lot of excitement, that first receptive does coming in, in that pre-rut phase. I'm like Dylan, I love scrapes. But when we transition out of this, and into that peak rut phase that we're talking about, I'm just like Sam. I like the big travel, long ridges. The one thing I'm not going to say the same thing Sam did. The one thing that I'll hit on, I pay attention to where I'm going to inherit a buck on my property. What travel corridor are they going to be coming on and off? Because most of us hunt parcels that aren't, they won't cover the total, travel distance that these bucks will travel. I mean, most of us are hunting anywhere from 50 to 100, a couple hundred acres. You're going to inherit, new bucks all the time. And where are those deer going to come from? And then where are they headed? So I pay attention to those a lot too. And I know the next podcast is a lot about, post rut. I really like that in post rut, but, pay attention to where you're going to inherit those deer from. And I definitely sit longer hours. I will be a little bit more intrusive. Your property will be, it will handle a little bit more intrusive approach than a pre-rut, type phase. And definitely post-rut will tolerate a lot. So I get a little more aggressive, but I also change my times. I will sit long hours in a stand, and sometimes I don't even go to my stand, until 8 or 9 o'clock, and just plan to sit there all afternoon trying to catch that buck leaving. That doe may become unreceptive, and he's going to start seeking a new one. So I will be there. A lot of times that takes place midday. So I'll sit longer hours and focus on that midday travel.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Lee, I'm curious. You mentioned you like to key in on your does, something that I have heard people talk about, and I feel like before I left Wisconsin a couple of years ago, was something that I was possibly getting kind of dialed in on. Have you been able to really track and see, hey, I know this doe group comes in October 31st. They're going to be the first ones in heat, and so I'm going to target that doe group. Have you been able to time them like that?
So I've been really paying attention to my fawns, who has the mature fawns too, who came in early last year, who got bred first last year. And some of these younger fawns, like I'm assuming that they're not going to be bred early, and, definitely these lower deer densities, it's not the same when you have a high deer density because, those bucks are they're breeding, and if they don't get bred, then those does will come in, cycle 28 days later, and it really runs down the bucks. You really can't hone in on it. She may have been in estrus, but just didn't get bred. She came in 28 days later, But when you have lower deer densities, it's like, well, Susie got bred first. She came in first. I can see when I go to a stand, I can pretty much tell you I'm going to see 2 does with twin fawns. I can tell you the does I'm going to see, and I can see the energy building in those pockets of does. I've got my food plot architecture all laid out, so I've got my herd, hubs around these food plots I don't mess with, and I can see the energy building in some of those core, zones. So I know that doe is more than likely going to be one of the earlier receptive does, and I will hone in on that area, and that buck will try to tend her in, a more, a thicket, a more security cover, and I'll be in and around that travel and around that thicket. I'll hone in on those areas because that's where he'll move her to. It's not going to be just in that wide open food plot.
Right.
So
you mentioned
yes.
there, you can see that energy building, and I had something come to mind for me, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what does that look like for you? Like if a guy's like, man, I want to be on the lookout for energy building in my does. What? I'm sure there's not like some electric aura that we can actually visibly see, but what kind of behavior are you seeing that's kind of keying you in on that?
Yeah, so I'll start from the stand, and then I'll move to like a more surveillance with a camera. If you're in a stand, a lot of times that first receptive doe, you got to think she hasn't been chased all year long, and now all of a sudden you've got bucks harassing her, and a lot of times she'll blow at that buck just like she would blow, at a predator or you. And I've noticed that a lot, that, I'll have everything right, and the doe will blow, and there'll be 3 bucks on her, and then when she blew, I noticed several more bucks came out of the woods and ran over to her. So sometimes that's a unique thing to look for. It happens every now and then, but definitely on the camera side of things, I pay attention to those bucks. The immature bucks will start bumping her a little bit too soon, and then that bigger, more mature buck, he's in that area. He's more cautious, but you'll see that energy build in him too. Definitely on the mock scrape. I mean, not the mock. If it's a mock scrape or a communal scrape, you'll start seeing that testosterone build in him. You'll start seeing everything's gentle until it's not. You'll start seeing his energy building, his belly bouncing. He goes from gentle sparring, to he's just, man, his mouth, he's breathing hard. It's building because he senses that she's about ready to breathe, and he knows when that time's right. And then that breakout is there. That first receptive doe gets more big deer killed, and it's one of my favorite times. And that's more of a pre-rut than the peak. The peak, I'm gonna say this real quick. Here's what I love about peak rut here. That is a strategy I do. For us, it's around Thanksgiving. Well, what's around Thanksgiving? Everybody's off work. The Orange Army comes out, and they're on every daggum parcel around here in full force. Guess what Lee does? I make sure that I back off of my property and make sure that I maintain my sanctuary balance, in that integrity. So they will push, I will import, their bucks, and they will export them because they're blitzing their properties. They've got literally a week to kill, and everybody and their cousin and everybody else is on that property. Guess what? That big buck's not. It ain't going to be in that. Now, people get lucky and it happens, but when you're in, a situation like Tennessee where you have long consecutive rifle seasons, 3-month consecutive rifle seasons, you got to be careful. You can't export that deer, to your neighbor's property. You just cannot do that. You'll get him killed.
Right. No, that's really good. And I want to talk more about that too when we do come back around to like late rut, post rut kind of conversations. Cause I think everybody here has a little bit different, gun hunting scenario. And, for us down here in Georgia, Alabama, obviously very, very long gun seasons. You guys up north, 10-day gun season, kind of the traditional, what people think of when they think of deer camp kind of vibe. And so, obviously plays into, that strategy for that time of year, but excited to talk more about that. For this one though, I want to discuss just real quick, everybody's number one, let's go with maybe your favorite rut hunting strategy. So like, and this can be anything. I mean, I don't know how much you guys conceptualize this in the sense of like, seeking, chasing, tending kind of stages of what we might consider the rut. Um, can you break it down like that? Probably a little bit, but it sure seems like there are just different deer in different moods doing different things on different days. So it seems harder to kind of break it down like that. But what's your favorite rut hunting strategy? And then as a bonus, give me maybe some of the habitat improvements that you have done or can do on someone's farm to help them create that same kind of scenario. Does that question make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, Dylan, let's kick off with you then. So, favorite rut hunting strategy. And if you're helping a client set up a farm or you're setting up your own farm, what are some of the things that you're going to do to make that strategy a reality?
Yeah, for me, that strategy is going to be kind of that concentrated area movement, the bringing stacking all the odds in your favor. I love the pinch points, the little pinches between two doe bedding areas, places that kind of concentrate the odds. You're stacking the odds in your favor. Like Lee mentioned, other areas that you might expect new faces to show up, or where you're going to kind of maybe catch some different movement from neighboring farms, that kind of thing. Just getting yourself in the right setup there. Along with that strategy, I mean, you say number one strategy. I think that mental side of that has to play into this when you're going into here. It's everybody talks about this being so magical. It's awesome, but you really got to still hunt smart. And to do that, you can't just go in there. I love the topic on coming in after daybreak. There's a lot of really good food sources that are out there that you can't hunt in the morning, but as long as you make sure it's clear and you get in there, I mean, there's a lot of places that come to mind for me that are, that have little pockets of bedding all around food that you can slip in and have a lot of late morning movement on into the evening. You're set up there all day. You just got to play the long game, and that the mental side of that gets really tough. And it goes right hand in hand with habitat and land improvements and that kind of thing. That's one that you get beat down quite a bit with things that go wrong or may take a little bit longer than you anticipated. That mental game of that, and that overly optimistic attitude gets you not only the success when you have a tag in your pocket, but it's also kind of that play for improving your habitat. And I think there's a lot of different things you can do to help kind of condense those areas. Say you've got that design with those corridors, and Sam does a really good job of laying those out. I know everybody's got kind of different ways of that, but there's ways to pinch that down to where you can get yourself these setups where make it uncomfortable, or I guess something not so desirable where your stand setups are, to where they're going to flow in those areas. And just creating that and kind of that on that canvas, it's kind of fun to be able to do that and just see that success, whether you kind of break up your bedding areas. Maybe it's monotonous cover. I think just doing that to where it's going to play into your type of strategy, your number one strategy, is always beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Jake, let's jump over to you there, talking about your number one rut hunting strategy and maybe what you're going to do to make it happen.
Yeah, and a lot of these strategies that we're talking about, like when Sam's talking, I'm thinking about stands that it reminds me of on the properties that I hunt, and that's honestly like what he was describing with the long ridge system and the travel corridors, trying to find some sort of a feature along that ridge that'll pinch the deer movement down as they're traveling that long distance. That's a very similar way to explain my favorite rut setup as well, except we're hunting flat ground, like almost like mixed farmland. So we're not hunting long ridge systems, but we're still hunting the travel. And one of my favorite setups is one of those pinch points that's located between two bedding areas. So for me on my property, these are areas that we cut a lot of trees down, and another one is a natural bedding area, just a really thick swamp in this open field that just behind the farmer's house. No one can go back there, so all the deer kind of pile in there. And we've got one on our property too that we worked on and cut several years ago. And deer travel between the two. And on our property, we have a lot of ponds, a lot of water. And on wetter years, this year it's dry, so they're walking right through it. So it's not as good this year. But on the wet years, they travel along the edge of this pond. And so what we've done is we knock trees down on the backside of our stand that actually pinches the deer down even further. So instead of walking, let's say, on the south side of this pond with a north wind, now they're condensed even further. That pinch is even tighter, and so everything is going on in between our stand and that water, because on the backside or the south side of all those down trees is an open field. And so they don't really travel in that open field. They want to stay within the cover. And so as they move from one bedding area to the other, a lot of times they're cutting right in front of the stand. And so if you just put a lot of hours in that stand with a north wind, blow your scent back into this open field, it's a pretty easy sit, like pretty safe sit. And like you guys are talking about, like you got to access through that field. And so you have to wait a little bit in the morning to get in there because you can't walk in there when it's dark because that's where the deer are. So you wait for that field to clear, get in that stand. But then once you're there, an hour or so after daylight, there's going to be movement back and forth. And so those are those all day sit stands. And that would be my other tip is just sit as long as you can. So if you get a great weather day, you get a good stand, sit as long as you can because like Lee said, those deer are going to get up as soon as they're done breeding a doe. They're going to go look for the next one. And we don't know when that's going to be. So you just want to make sure that you're in the woods when that happens to give yourself the best possible chance. So habitat improvements to enhance that pinch point would be a blocker behind your stand, or even you could put, if you don't have a pond, and then we might need to figure something out this year or for next year, because this year our pond is gone. It's so dry that this is the first year that I can remember that water isn't there. And so a lot of the deer are walking right through it instead of going around. So we got to figure something out for next year to pinch those deer back towards the stand. I haven't sat there yet during the rut, so we'll see what happens. But the cameras are showing you can see them in the background. They're walking right through it. So it's going to be a little bit interesting this year with no water. But another habitat improvement on the other side you could do is that bedding area. If you have mature hardwoods, if it's an area that you want to improve to encourage deer to bed down, you have to start taking some trees down. You got to get sunlight to the forest floor to get that new growth. So there's a lot that you can do on your property to create predictable deer movement.
Right, right. Yeah, that's good. I want to touch base on something that's been mentioned twice so far. Just real quick, this, hunting a little bit later in the day. It seems like as we get into the rut, early season, if I'm hunting a morning, really it's that first hour or two of daylight that I'm feeling like that's when my action's going to happen. And I'm inclined to leave the woods a little bit earlier in the early season. As you get into the rut, however, it seems like I almost don't care if I'm there at first light because it doesn't feel like that's when it's going to happen. It's not then that I see the bucks up on their feet. It's almost like the bucks let the does kind of make their way back to the bedding areas, and that's when they start hopping. That's when they start checking. Are you guys seeing something similar? I'll just throw that out there to anybody. Are y'all seeing something similar to that, or is it important to you to be in there at first light?
Well, I'll jump on that, Josh. And I still get in there early because, unlike these field edges, I'm oftentimes coming up through a lot of timber to get to a ridge top. So it's a little bit different for me with the topography that I have. But what I have seen is that in my encounters in the rut have been more typically this mid to late morning, possibly even early afternoon, more of this middle of the day part, which the rest of the season we don't think too highly of. But at this point in time, it's that late morning that a lot of my opportunities have come at mature bucks because they're out cruising, like you say, from spot to spot.
Right, right. Now, are you guys doing a lot of all day sits?
I would be, from dark to dark at times, or perhaps there's a little shift midday that you're going to a slightly better afternoon setup than you had in the morning. So you might pivot from one spot to another, but they're not too far away from each other. Usually they're complementary stands, not necessarily a whole new area of your farm.
Right, right. Well, Sam, while we've got you mic'd up here, why don't you go ahead and share kind of your top rut hunting strategy and maybe some of the habitat improvement that goes into that.
Sure. Yeah, I want to build out what I was describing before with the ridges because I have more topography, I think, than any of you guys in where I'm hunting. And one of the things that I want to make a key point of talking about, because it's a common mistake to make, is being literally right on top of that ridge. A lot of times, we talk about deer running ridges. Well, especially your mature bucks, they're not necessarily running that ridge. They're running just down from the side of the ridge. They're on one side or the other. Oftentimes at the tops of those drainages, it's thicker, brushier, a little bit better concealment perhaps as they move through that cover, but it's still this, again, can be miles long ridge system that they're navigating throughout. So what I like to do is, rather than trying to sit on a ridge and maybe it's just, you look and you scout and you say, I've got just the right tree, I can see either side. Well, that shouldn't necessarily be your goal. It should be picking a side, and perhaps I have locations where there's a stand on either side of the ridge depending on what the wind is. If they're trying to scent one side or the other, depending on the wind, it's going to be more favorable. I might pick that stand for that day. Again, committing to one side or the other. All of this, as far as habitat improvement, hinges on great corridors, continuous travel. We want to have long travel, and usually that is defined best by the key pinch points that might be, a tight grade in a location where it's very steep, and then the first flat or flatter spot where they can run a little bit better on it. Connect the dots of those locations, stay off the ridge, and hunt those pinch points. If you have the ability to put some mock scrapes on there, even better, and certainly having one at your hunting setup. But those are often going to be, and they don't take a lot of work. Keeping those corridors, these are natural corridors a lot of times. You have a few enhancements to try and pinch them down a little bit better. Have a mock scrape at your stand, and with a few small improvements, you can have a really great rut setup for this time of year.
Right. Very good. Well, Lee, let's kick it over to you then. And I know, some of your favorite time to hunt in the season, maybe a little later than some of the rest of us, but what are those top rut hunting tactics for you?
So here's one thing that we haven't talked about. Sam hit a lot. I love topography pinches and travel corridors. I love natural things that just, funnel, deer in those travel corridors. I love the top side of a topography pinch, a gully or whatever, when we're on clients' properties, it amazes them. It's like, man, I bet you $1 million. Yeah, this is going to be great. It's 10 out of 10 access. High side trail is going to come around, that top side of that drainage every single time. There's going to be a convenient, top side travel to those drainage ditches. I love hunting topography. It's awesome. But one thing we haven't talked about is actually calling. And, everything everybody else said is spot on. But calling is a tricky thing when you're in peak rut. And I mean peak rut, when all of your does, the majority of your does, I shouldn't say all of them, the majority of the does on your property are in estrus at that time. Calling can be tricky, and it is tempting to go out there and bang your horns together and grunt at them. But, if you're hunting a mature buck and he's the dominant buck and he has breeding rights, and for somebody like me, I have a low deer density, I'm usually only hunting one mature or two mature bucks on my property, then he has those breeding rights. And if I go clanging my horns or sound like an aggressive challenger, I have witnessed it where that buck moves those does away from me. And I made that mistake years ago, and I actually did end up killing the deer later. But I was like, that made all the sense in the world. He had the girls, I challenged him, and he's like, why I gotta go fight? I got him, and he moved away. So it's, knowing when to call and when not to call is so important. And you may get a satellite buck that's, he may have the rack, but he may be a subordinate buck to, I've got a lot of 4 points and 6 points that are bad genetic deer that they don't know how big their horns are, but they're dominant. They're just bullies. I try to kill those, but he may have the breeding rights, and your subordinate buck may be the one that you could get to come over there. You just got to know your herd and who is dominant, who isn't. And I pay attention to that. And, so you gotta know when to call. And that's what I like later. I like calling early and pre-rut, and then after that peak rut, I really like, getting down and dirty with it. So that's one thing we didn't mention. Just be careful when you're calling. Know your herd. Know who's who in the pecking order, and know, don't arbitrarily just start clanging horns. It may or may not work out for you. So
I've resorted to just kind of leaving some of that stuff at home, because if you've got it there, I don't know about you guys, but it's just too tempting to use it. You got that little doe bleat can. It's like, well, what can it hurt? And you just want to start messing with it. I see you guys laughing. You guys have probably been in a similar boat.
Well,
Hey, and another thing I'll say about it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna go ahead with. Sorry,
here's one thing. No, you got to make sure too that if you're calling, if you're calling in an area where he will circle around you and it's convenient for him to circle around, he always will, and he will always come around you. So if you know you're going out, definitely post rut, which is the time I love to call when there's few receptive does. Man, they're going to come in, they're going to want to fight. I love that time, and make sure you're in an area that makes it real inconvenient for him to get around you. And if he does try to, it exposes him. Don't go in where it's going to be deer 360 and he can get to slip on you, because you may never know he was there.
Right. I was in that what you just described got me last year. I was in a very, very thick, gnarly, marshy area that Sam is pretty familiar with. And I got down in there where I could see a good ways out in front of me, and I knew there was some bedding off in the distance. So I did some calling, and all of a sudden I just heard a buck just destroying every tree around him. He was thrashing everything. He was grunting, and I was like, "Oh man, this is going to happen." He goes around, crosses a ditch with 4 feet of water in it, comes up the other side, circles all the way around back behind me, and starts coming up behind me. Gets to about 20 yards before he catches my wind. I don't know how big he was. He sounded like a moose coming through the trees, but I thought for sure there's no way this guy's getting downwind of me. And he was acting super aggressive, had nothing in the world to fear but other hunters. And boom, he ended up catching me. So like you said, if they can get downwind of you, they're going to do it. And he was big and bad until he realized I was probably toting a bow around and was not a deer. So disappointing, a little bit heartbreaking, but hey, it happens. Well, guys, thanks for joining me this evening for this episode of the podcast. Folks, you can go head over to our YouTube channel and watch this in person if you would like to. Guys, any last comments?
Get out there and be in the stand.
Stay off
That's
your
right.
phone.
Get out there, be in the we should
keep it fun.
That's a whole episode. Put your phone down. It's cost me a deer or 3 in my lifetime. So anyway, all right. Awesome, guys. Thanks for joining me this evening.